Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. I felt for some reason like explaining why I do what I do today. I suppose it's because a war is going on that's very serious. First thing to say, of course, is that I spent the last 2 weeks addressing that in my own way. Um, but I wanted to talk about a deeper reason that I come back to economics after forays into history and political theory by telling you a story about myself. Um, as I was considering going to college and choosing my career, my college path, and therefore my career path, probably, right? I had two paths that I was seriously thinking about. One was creative writing, which would probably mean an English literature degree. The other was software, programming, which would mean a degree from the School of Engineering. So as I was making this decision, I already knew something about academia from my reading, because I'd already been doing reading in history and mass murder by states starting when I was 11. So I'd been doing it for some years by that time, as well as I knew something about software from hobby programming since that I'd been doing since I was saving programs to a cassette drive on an Atari 400. And I'm not joking about that, by the way. It was called the Atari Program Recorder, and it literally used standard issue cassette tapes to record the code, save your programs off. I had already noticed at that time that scholars could easily drift off into the ether of theory, disconnected from reality. Whereas in programming, you had a hard check on crazy ideas. That is, if you didn't write your code, it would crash, right? And I remember I thought of this as slamming into the brick wall, right? The brick wall of reality. So I decided on engineering because I wanted to stay rooted in reality. The regular hard check of my ideas against what actually works. It's partially because I saw in myself someone who, is very happy to do theory and could float off into the ether and get disconnected, and I didn't want that. Well, the economy is one place where the theories of politicians and neocons crash into the brick wall of reality. And they make fun of us for noticing economic burdens. But all their high flown rhetoric and warmongering means a lot less to people when those people can't make ends meet anymore because of higher prices on everything. And this is treated as a crass consideration. We ought to have more lofty concerns than, feeding our families and being able to drive to work. But I personally don't see it that way. Why should I put further NATO expansion so that year 125 of the US empire can be another growth year above taking care of my family, above the needs of my community, of my people? Maybe if we minded our own business and loved our neighbor rather than getting caught up in global crusades, then we might have a better world. So that's part of the reason that this show comes back again and again to economics. It's a reality check. So let's have a quick reality check today. I don't think this will take that long. There's two parts to this story, a little bit interweaved, but I'm going to kind of do it in this order. Part one is how things were looking, especially in regards to inflation, on February 23rd, right? Up to the day before Russia invaded the Ukraine. Part two, we'll look at a little bit, obviously it's early days, a little snapshot of how it's looking since then. Okay, so thanks to some friends, I have some great content for you to give us that situation. Maven, I didn't know he did this. He does little updates. Here's his update. Now get ready for this. I couldn't believe it. He posted this on, yes, can you see this? February 23rd, 2022. That's exactly what I wanted. Well, how did the world look right before the war started, right? Well, in, I guess, the Anglosphere countries, you see inflation that by our standards is considered quite high. 5.5% in the United Kingdom, 7.5%. This would be consumer price inflation, right? 7.5% in the US, 5.5% in the EU, 5% in Canada, and then up-and-comers in the world of inflation. Australia, 3.5%, the highest since 2008. New Zealand, almost 6%, 30-year high, and South Africa, 6%. These are not great numbers. These are not sustainable numbers to keep at that level of inflation month after month, year after year. He threw in something else that I just had to share. Leaving the Anglosphere, there's some, what does he call them? Unhealthy inflation rates that I knew about Turkey, but I didn't know about many of these. Turkey, almost 50%. Moldova, 16%. Ukraine, 10%. Now, by the way, the date on this is, I've switched to one that's February 16th. But again, pre-war picture here, right? So 10% in Ukraine, 10% in Belarus, 36% in Iran, 139% in Syria. Well, they're in the middle of a war. 224% in Lebanon. What? What else jumps out? 472% in Venezuela. Of course, we know that Venezuela's been going through a hyperinflation. 77% in Cuba, 50% in Argentina. And then he gives us a little peek into Africa. I think Prudentialist will be talking soon more about the situation in Africa. 34% in Ethiopia, 15% in Nigeria. Again, keeping to this pre-war picture, here's a little breakdown of that CPI. Notice that the all items 7.9%, and we'll go through an article that talks about that a little bit more. Breaking that down, food is at that 7.9%. Energy, though, was at 25%. 25% consumer price index inflation on energy before the war started. Okay? So I wanted to, part of the reason to emphasize this, of course, is that we strongly expect that there'll be plenty to blame on the war, and I will too, but more will be blamed on the war than ought to be, right? We already had the effects of the lockdown measures, staggering growth in the money supply from the Fed. All of these things preceded the war. So, that quote I love sharing, the fight of liberty against tyranny is the fight of remembering against forgetting. So let's not let them make us forget. Okay, so yeah, note that big energy inflation factor even before we get into the war, which of course has had a big, tremendous effect on energy supplies. Okay, so here's an article from ABC News talking about the 7.9% figure. And let's be clear what we're talking about. It is the 12 months ending in February, and it didn't include most of the oil and gas price increases that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. So this is looking at 12 months that ends in February. It catches like the first week of the war. But as they note here, really what you're seeing is what the situation was pre-war. So what do we got? This is U.S. price inflation, 7.9% over the past year, jump in consumer prices. The sharpest spike since 1982. 1982, you might remember, was President Reagan, but it was the end of those Carter inflation years in the late 70s, which I remember actually. The Carter inflation years, which actually went into the early 80s, and then finally, I think Volcker at the Fed put an end to it. But actually, it was pretty bad right at the beginning of Reagan's first term. Okay, and we're seeing those kinds of inflation rates again, like back in those late 70s times. All right, so even before the war further accelerated price increases, robust consumer spending, solid pay raises, and persistent supply shortages had sent consumer inflation to its highest level in 4 decades, right? It just so happens 2022 minus 40 is 1982, right? So higher inflation than during the lockdown, again, before the war started. Housing costs have risen sharply. We'll see more on that in a moment. For most Americans, inflation is running far ahead of the pay raises that many have received in the past year. What's considered a good raise for a salary man like me, right? A couple percent is a good raise. Well, when your price inflation is 8%, you're losing, right, each year, even with your raise. So inflation is running ahead of those pay raises, making it harder for people to afford necessities like food, gas, and rent. They say the Federal Reserve is set to raise interest rates several times this year, beginning with a modest hike next year. That's an attempt to stem the inflation, right? To try to pull back instead of where they've been, which is easy money. Who knows if they'll stick with that policy given what's going on? Usually, as we saw in 2020, when there's a crisis, immediately it's quantitative easing and all their tools in their toolbox, right? As opposed to tightening things. So energy prices, which soared after the invasion, jumped again. This is going to post-war a little bit, post-beginning of the war, after Biden said the U.S. would bar oil imports from Russia. So the economic consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine have upended a broad assumption among many economists and at the Fed that inflation would begin to ease this spring because prices rose so much in March and April of 2021 that comparisons to a year ago would show declines. So we already saw price rises 12 months ago. Now we're in March now, right? So March of 2021, we already saw big price rises. They're thinking, hey, it's going to level out compared to that unusual high a year ago. It's going to start looking better the 12-month comparisons. Well, so much for that, right? This fellow estimates that inflation could reach as high as 9% in March or April. That would just be 1% more than the 8% that they're reporting pre-war, right? The cost of wheat, corn, cooking oils, such metals as aluminum and nickel, nickel's a weird one, we'll see a chart in a moment on that, have also soared since the invasion. Ukraine and Russia are leading exporters of those commodities, so we would expect to have a big impact on those prices, right? Even before Russia's invasion, this is part one of our story, right? Even before Russia's invasion, inflation was not only rising sharply, but also broadening into additional sectors of the economy. Short supplies of items like autos, building materials, household goods. Here's a quick story from this week. I happen to have a car repair. And as I'm talking to them about how quickly will it take to get things, to get the part that's needed and so forth, they said, well, if we can get the part. And I'm like, wait, what do you mean if you can get the part? Tell me about that. And he said, we just can't get certain things. We haven't even been able to get oil filters. I was like, whoa, wait. Just regular old oil filters, like when you do an oil change? He said, yeah. Some of them we can get, some we can't get, and they don't know when we'll get them. And the mechanic I'm talking to said, one of those oil filters is the one in my truck, and I don't know what I'm going to do when it's time to change the oil. We can't get it. So that's frightening. Worth noting, they call out rents in particular. Costs are surging at their fastest pace in decades. They say steady job growth and high home prices are encouraging more people to move into apartments. So rental costs are elevated by the most. They've moved up the most in 2 decades. Apartment vacancy rates have reached their lowest level since 1984. Again, almost 40 years ago. Return, right? Except we're returning to something that wasn't very fun at the time. So in the final 3 months of last year, wages and salaries jumped 4.5%. Yay, if you're getting paid that jump of salaries, right? The sharpest such increase in at least 20 years. Problem with that, of course, is those pay raises have led many companies to raise prices to offset their higher labor costs. So we're seeing costs inflation ripple through the economy, right? And then they note soaring energy costs, which we've already seen. Now, this is an interesting comparison. Ryan, who will be back with us soon, Ryan Turnipseed said, is this, how reminiscent of the 70s is this? I'm not going to do a deep dive on that. I'd have to do some prep for that. But this article brings it up. That the pattern is akin to the stagflation dynamic that made the economy of the 1970s miserable for many Americans. Okay, so now we're just going to do a couple charts and we're going to be done really quick today. Now, moving to post-invasion. I've, thanks to Black Horse, who's been very helpful for this, he provided, I'm sorry, I'm not sure who gave me this one, but a lot of what we'll be looking at is from Black Horse. This is commodity price changes versus a year ago. He posted this on March 8th. And so you see some interesting things at the top of the list here. Heating oil up 118%, wheat up 104%. Some people eat wheat. We don't eat that much wheat here because my wife eats gluten-free. Let me recommend oat flour if it doesn't shoot up as well. You have to learn how to cook a little bit differently with it, but I've gotten used to it. It's just fine. I like oats. So think about oat flour as a substitute. Anyway, Brent crude up 85%, gasoline up 80%, coffee up 74%, natural gas up 69%. And then we get into things like aluminum, corn, cotton. Notice again the energy items on this: heating oil, Brent crude, gasoline, natural gas. So the energy sector in particular is going to be a problem. We don't use that much energy for stuff, right? Shouldn't be too bad. Okay. So yeah, now focusing in on oil. This fellow, Holger, wow, Schapitz, I haven't even tried to say that name. Let me share this fellow because he seems interesting. Where's my chat? Here we go. This guy shares stuff every day. He's sharing it from Germany, but he has a wide view, I think. Maybe particularly useful to Europeans. Oil soared to just shy of $140 a barrel after the White House said it was considering an embargo on Russian supplies. And so you can see it up to a high point relative to, say, 8 to 10 years ago, right? It's back up to those levels after the economic crisis that we discussed recently with Black Horse of 2008, 2009 era. Okay, there are a couple other things I wanted to highlight from here. European gas soaring to new record highs, jumped by 35%, just, in the last few weeks. What else? Sorry. Okay, here we go. Gold is up again. In times of crisis, gold tends to win. It just hit 2,000 again, which it hadn't since 2020, with the uncertainty around the beginning of the lockdowns and everything. But it's back up again. This is interesting. The Polish currency, they don't use the euro, they use the zloty. And he says it tumbles past 5 zlotys per euro for the first time ever as war in Ukraine spooks markets. As you might know, Poland is in a particularly precarious position. They're taking on a lot of Ukrainian refugees, I think, and then they're particularly impacted by some of the economic impacts of this. So Poland is something to keep your eye on. Okay, I think there's just one more thing I wanted to get out of this. Yeah, here we go. All right, so we were looking at energy, but another thing that is of interest is the commodity index. And look at this. So this is from last week, and he posted this 3 days ago. So this is, say, first week of March, roughly, late February, right after, a week after the invasion, something like that. We see a sharp spike. Did he give a percentage on this? Yeah, plus 13.4%, the biggest gain on record. Now, eclipsing anything seen in the 1970s. So it's always a little hard to see the axes. So let me try to walk you through this a little bit. This chart starts in 1956. So we're looking at a time horizon of over 60 years. The 70s is the first sort of bit of noise there, right? And going up to what it looks like 7 or 8%. Well, now we're at over 13% last week. Commodities are things that most of us need in our day-to-day practical life. Okay, and I think that was all I was going to do from these reports. Let me see if there's one more thing. It's just talking about NASDAQ slumping. Don't really care. Oh, yeah. Glad I kept scrolling. Look at nickel. He says, WTF? Nickel jumps to record high as supply risk sparks short squeeze. This is insane. Now, he isn't showing it over a long time period, so it's hard to say how, without a longer-term chart, he's showing a 6-month chart here. But this is insane. I guess nickel is one of those things that we get from Russia. I don't know. So I'm ashamed to say I don't know what the industrial uses of nickel are, so I don't know what the larger implications of that are. Okay, and then one more thing on commodities, and gonna have a real short show today. So Maven provided some very useful info for me. Thank you, Maven. He says a few commodities to keep an eye on. Lumber. We were doing lumber memes last year. Well, lumber's back. Look at this. So this is a 25-year chart. So it's kind of squished here, but you see two peaks. One is the higher one is when we were doing the lumber memes like a year ago, right? Well, now we're basically back up there right now. I'm feeling this at home, or we're feeling this at home because my wife is building various duck coops and things like that, horse shelter, and she's basically hunting for wood. She said I could share, that she would go by someplace, see that somebody had taken something apart and just thrown out a bunch of woods with nails in it and everything, and she scooped it up. So we're on the hunt for cheap lumber. Okay, oil at 122. Sorry, I don't know which chart is oil. There we go. Oil at 122. Again, reaching a high that we haven't seen since the economic crisis of almost 14 years ago, 2007, 2008 era. He also shows soybean skyrocketing back up to levels we haven't seen for 10 years. And then what's this last one? Oh, and wheat, of course. This is a 5-year chart, but you can see that wow. 2020, when all this lockdown stuff was going down, it's at the level of, 600 and then slowly climbs to 800. Inflation was already happening, as I pointed out at the beginning of the show. And now it's up to $12.23 dollars per bushel. So that's, double from 2 years ago. So my understanding is, there's two things to talk about. I mentioned one, which is that, he has more. I might do a few more. Let me see. Okay, there we go. Yeah, we'll do more. So, I mentioned at the top of the show, I don't think it's wrong to be concerned about the effects of these things on our local communities. I think if everyone did that everywhere, I think we'd be in good shape. We'd push back on the madness and say, hey, we can't afford this crap. Stop it. But it is worth noting, and this is where I wanted to direct you to the Prudentialist, the impacts on economies that don't have as much wiggle room as we do to absorb some of this. I think it's hard for us, even here in America, to be hit with some of these things. But for some parts of the world, rocketing wheat costs and so forth mean that it's more than just a little bit, cutting back on some luxuries or something. It can really have a tragic impact in some parts of the world. And I think Prudentialist is going to talk about that a bit, focusing on Africa. Okay, so let's see if there's anything else we want to talk about. He shows gold, which we've shown, silver, copper, 10 up, seed oils. Sorry, we have a friend who's hates seed oils. Corn close to an all-time high, and of course he shows the nickel chart, which is just crazy. And then aluminum sky high and rising. There's aluminum. Okay, anything else? Let's see. Green tech metals, palladium, lithium, cobalt. Right, lithium, as you may know, is key to, let's see, is this lithium? Yeah, lithium. Oh, wow, look at that. That's several year chart, I think. Wow, so lithium is used in the most batteries, I think. I hope I'm getting that right on the tech. So tell me in the chart if I'm messing that up. But as I understand, we still would have quite a lot of batteries in laptops, in phones, and so forth that are using lithium. So that hits those, electronics, consumer electronics, and so forth. Okay, yeah, and then Maven's comment is a good one. He says, remember that these rises will take many months to filter into consumer prices. The rises you're experiencing so far are mostly monetary phenomenon. The effect of these rises will be on top of what you currently pay. That's absolutely right. Okay. That's all I wanted to do. Short and sweet. Lay out the story and show you some evidence for it, which is that, number one, we were already seeing serious inflation. As we've covered on previous episodes, structural problems in the economy from obviously the lockdowns, but a long-running, since 1971, as our friends at WTF happened in 1971 always point out, since 1971, a long-running inflation, basically. There's been, higher bits of inflation and lower, but it's the overall trend has been towards inflation. And what does Austrian economics teach us? It teaches us that this discoordinates the economy, right? And it creates an unstable, unsustainable situation. And we were seeing it manifesting again very strongly prior to February 24th. So we already have a structure that is not sound economically, right? And it's manifesting in higher and higher prices, consumer inflation, and then bam, wartime. Okay, so that's what I wanted to share. I think, let's see if there's anything to share from anybody. Okay, fair enough. Skolsky says pre-war in Ukraine would be 2014. I'm, of course, talking about the effect of the war that just started, but obviously, yes. My understanding is that Kiev has been shelling the two regions in the east of Ukraine that wanted to break away for 8 years. So yeah, it's just more of the same in a way for them. And I think that might be the show. I've been doing some shorter shows. Probably helps that I haven't had guests on. Moves quicker when it's just me. Okay, so I think that's all I will cover for today. Program note is that I will be off next week. In fact, I will be going to the Mises Institute with Ryan Turnipseed. We'll actually be traveling together. He'll join us at my home and we'll travel there. We did the same thing for the US event. This time, though, I'll be bringing my daughter, one of my daughters, my teen daughter, who is trying to tear through human action before we get to the Mises Institute next week. So wish her luck. She's reading every day faithfully, and she's rocking on. She's halfway through. She might make it. And we'll be meeting up with a friend I met at the Mises Institute a couple decades ago who's stayed in touch and basically become a family friend. So really looking forward to that, but it will mean no show next week. But of course, when I go to the Mises Institute, I get loaded up with ideas for the show, contacts, usually walk away with a pile of books. So it's not exactly that I'm doing nothing for the show when I'm off next week. In fact, it'll all come back and make the show better. So thanks, everybody, and see you next time.